The first speaker that we have for tonight is a friend of mine, a dear friend, and yes, he's a dear friend. And I'll read what it says here. So he's an orbital analyst instructor at Vandenberg Air Force Base, but he was in the service. I think you work for the military, don't you? But you're not in the military.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So and then so he's a systems engineer, and he has a master's degree from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. He's an avid space enthusiast and was a leader in the development of the neatest thing. It's a roll-off portable observatory, and there's only one. He says there's only one in California or wherever. Central Coast. Right? Only one in Central Coast, and it's actually like a STEM building. It's a portable building, and it has an observatory, but it also has other science things that are included. So it's fantastic, and he did that, and so it's a wonderful thing for people and for children especially, and. So he's going to share his experience and kind of shocking video about objects in space and discuss the Kessler syndrome, and he'll tell you what that is. And what else? He'll tell you about that kind of stuff. I want to let him tell you about it. It has to do with, all the satellites that are out there and running into each other. So, yeah. So I'll let you have the microphone now. I'll get out of your way.
Thank you.
So this is Steve Williams, everyone.
Okay, let's admit it. Everybody loves collisions. If that weren't the case, we wouldn't love instant replay so much, right? So what I have is a compilation of videos featuring collisions. 4 collisions to be exact. One involving football tackles, the second one involving NASCAR racing collisions. The third one will involve trap shooting, shooting a shotgun, hitting the ceramic plates. And the final one will be satellite collisions. So this is 3.5-minute video. But while you're watching this video, I want you to think about one question. How fast are they going in meters per second? Think the 100-meter run in the Olympics. All right, and then we'll be a quiz after. Just kidding. But here are the compilation videos.
Manning-led Broncos were marching down the field. But just as their offense was finally starting to click, tragedy unfolded before their very eyes.
Separation. Oh, big hit, Sanders. Now McLeod came over, and they're going to say he hit a defenseless receiver.
Jeez, bro, didn't see that coming.
Junior will win Daytona. And the big one happens behind them.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, the 11 gets kind of stuck in the middle there and comes across the Ford's bumper. As he does, he spins back in, gets the 3 airborne, and he just gets projected off the other cars right up into the fence.
Go!
It's okay.
Until 2007, experts tracked around 12,000 large pieces of junk. But since then, 2 events have caused the situation to degenerate. One involved Cosmos 2251, a Russian satellite in low Earth orbit that suddenly malfunctioned. The Russians could no longer communicate with it and were unable to deorbit it to Earth. In a perpendicular trajectory at the same altitude, a brand new American satellite called Iridium 33 was in orbit. The impact sent debris flying in all directions. Around 1,000 pieces larger than 3 inches and thousands of smaller fragments were ejected into space, posing a threat to all the devices in low Earth orbit. This collision proves that an out-of-control object in low orbit is a danger to all working satellites. Another event worthy of Star Wars took place when China decided to deliberately destroy a weather satellite that was no longer in use, using a ballistic missile armed with an infrared seeker and a warhead. It was an arrogant show of strength by Chinese authorities, with no concern for the consequences. As a result of these two events, by 2010 there were more than 17,000 large pieces of debris circling the Earth.
Yay, it worked. Lucky for you guys, we don't have time for a quiz. So I will give you the speed and velocity of those collisions. The first one being the football tackle, 10 meters per second. The second one involving NASCAR, 80 meters per second. The third one involving the trap shooting, 380 meters per second. The last one, satellite collisions, over 7,000 meters per second. So just think how fast you run the 5K race. Does this in less than a second. So imagine the cascade of those satellites, of those collision debris with other objects. Remember that movie Gravity? It would trigger a phenomenon called the Kessler syndrome, where one or more collisions can trigger a runaway effect and render an orbit unusable. Again, my name is Steve Williams, and I will be talking to you tonight about my background in the space career field. And then I'll talk about the current space environment of the space around the Earth. And finally, I'll talk to you about what you can do to be a good steward of the heavens. First, my background. I have 35 years in the space career field. Yes, I'm that old. I have a master's degree in aeronautics from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. My interest in space began when I watched the series Cosmos by Carl Sagan, way back when. I was wowed by his description and wondered how he brought the universe down to Earth. So much so that every Christmas, I asked my parents for a telescope after that. And on my third request, I finally got it. And with that small refractor telescope, for the first time, I saw the wonders of the moon, Jupiter, and Saturn. When I turned 18, I joined the Air Force. And wouldn't you know it, they sent me to Woomera, South Australia to do a space operations mission, no less. And with that mission, I was part of the first Gulf War. And the significance of that is that was the first space war involving the system I used and GPS. You remember the Persian Gulf War? So I even dug up a few photos of my time there. This is my going away photo with my crew in the pub. And even got a good, or not so decent, going away kiss from an Aussie bloke in that pub. So From Woomera, traveled all the way across the Pacific to California and sent to Beale Air Force Base. And that is called a phased array warning system. It's 10 stories high, and I worked inside of it. Its primary mission is detection of intercontinental ballistic missiles. Its secondary mission was space track. So it projected a lot of energy out to space, so much so that we could track satellites and debris coming through the fence. And that's what we did 99.99% of the time, space track. So I spent 3 years there, and then I was sent by the Air Force to good old Cavalier, North Dakota. That's the same kind of radar. It's a phased array radar, except this one has one phase. I worked inside of it as well. No windows, right? And the designation for that radar was called PARCS, Perimeter Acquisition Radar Attack Characterization System. It did the same type of mission, except it was looking over the northern hemisphere, the North Pole, to detect missiles. And again, most of the time was spent detecting and sending observations for satellites and objects in space. And I can't leave you without a winter image of Cavalier, because those were the most impactful winters of my life. But after Cavalier, the Air Force had some mercy on me and sent me to Vandenberg Air Force Base. And there, my first job was an instructor for phased array warning systems with the Air Education and Training Command. I did that for 4 years, and after that, I decided to try out the California Air National Guard. I liked California so much in this area that I got out of active duty, tried the Guard, and consequently, I was part of the first space mission for California Air National Guard. And that is a Milstar satellite system. In point of interest, that satellite system technology, mainly the minimization of jamming signals, was invented by an actress named Hedy Lamarr and her composer husband, George Antheil, in 1942. So that's an example of art and science colliding. And I stayed in Vandenberg, and from there, after a few years of doing that, I began my career as an orbital analyst. As an OA, I kept track of debris, or objects that is, in orbit around the Earth. And no, there are no aliens that I can speak of. But seriously, I used the information generated about those objects to protect important assets, such as the ISS and the Hubble Space Telescope, and a myriad of other government, civilian, and international satellite owners. Protect from what, you might ask? Space junk, malfunctioning satellite or non-functioning satellites, rocket bodies, and debris that are man-made. So now let's talk about that space environment. What are we tracking? So these numbers are based on information I gathered from a website called spacetrack.org. So the total amount that we're tracking are 46,500 objects. Of those, 10,500 are active satellites, and 19,100 are rocket bodies and debris. Now that is trackable. What about untrackable debris? 130 million, approximately. less than 1 centimeter in size. All these objects reside in distinct orbits. Think of them as lanes on a racetrack. I'll describe those orbits as defined within my work system called the Astrodynamic Support Workstation, ASW for short. It is the predominant system used by the world to keep track of objects in space. So here are the 5 distinct orbits, or lanes. Low LEO, low Earth orbit. Regular LEO, high LEO. Then you have MEO, medium Earth orbit. And finally, geosynchronous orbits. And here is an image of that so-called racetrack. You see the first 3 lanes, the LEO, low LEO, LEO, and high LEO, are in that orange band around the Earth, small band. I can imagine them whipping, can you imagine them whipping around at 7,000 meters per second? And that small region contains 84% of the objects that we are tracking, trackable objects. And then you have that huge MEO region that only contains 3% of our trackable objects. And that small, that narrow band, green band at the outside is geosynchronous. And there we are tracking 12% of the trackable objects. Now let's look at low LEO in more detail. Low LEO has an altitude of 500 kilometers above the Earth and below. They're most susceptible to atmospheric drag in that area. Objects are most susceptible to atmospheric drag. So what is atmospheric drag? Imagine driving down Highway 1, which you probably did to get here, and holding your hand out the window. If you hold it perpendicular to the wind, you're going to feel more force pushing your hand back. But if you hold it parallel to the wind, you're going to feel less force pushing your arm back. So that's the idea of drag. In low LEO, we have much more drag. And drag has the effect of lowering the orbits of the satellites and increasing their speeds, their velocities, and bringing them down through the atmosphere quicker. And you can think of this as a fast lane, where collisions can happen at 7,600 meters per second. Popular assets that reside in this lane, we've all heard of the ISS, the International Space Station. That's around 400 kilometers in altitude. We also have the initial version of, or the most updated or latest version of Starlink called V2 Mini. And currently there are 1,982 of those and at an altitude of around 350 kilometers. Now let's look at the LEO lane. LEO has an altitude between 500 and 1,000 kilometers. And it's mostly populated with polar orbiting satellites. This area is most susceptible to orbital collisions because they pass through all latitudes as they cross the equator. Collisions in this zone can happen, again, at 7,000 meters per second. Popular assets, you've all heard of the Hubble Space Telescope. It's contributed a lot to what we know about the universe. And I'll never forget the Hubble Deep Field, where you stared at a region of space no wider than a straw hole for several days and saw 10,000 galaxies in that small space. So a system you may have not heard of is the A-Train. A train, or afternoon train for short, or short for afternoon train. This is a group of 8 satellites in a type of polar orbit that crosses the equator within minutes of each other, 10 minutes total. And they allow for simultaneous coordinated measurements to obtain comprehensive information about atmospheric components or processes happening at the same time. With these, we have a better understanding of the important parameters related to climate change. This region also contains the initial version of Starlink, which launched in May of 2019. And now there are about 4,662 of those residing at an altitude of approximately 550 kilometers. The initial version of Starlink. So we talked about Starlink, right? They're in low LEO and LEO. So let's take a closer look at Starlink here. It's the largest of several mega constellations that are currently or planned to be put into orbit. And for Starlink, there's 6,350 in orbit as of August of this year. And they've been approved by the FCC to launch 12,000. So they're halfway there, right? Over half. But they submitted paperwork to launch 30,000 more. And that if you've been lucky enough to walk outside during twilight, you may have seen something like this. A train of lights in the sky. There's nothing like that out there at the moment. And what that is Starlink. There's up to 60 at a time. And they're easier to see, initially after they launch. But with their planned 30,000 that they hope to launch, we can envision this, a Starlink nightmare. Too much of a good thing, right? And practically, it could interfere with radio astronomy as well. Now let's look at high LEO. That is an altitude of 1,000 to 5,000 kilometers. And there is some atmospheric drag, but not very significant unless there's high solar activity. Collision can occur at the upper region at almost 6,000 meters per second. In high LEO, we have OneWeb, which is comparable to Starlink. They are orbiting at an altitude of 1,200 kilometers. There's 630 of those currently. They plan to launch up to 700 high LEO. Next, let's look at MEO, medium Earth orbit. That's an altitude of 5,000 to 37,786 kilometers. Remember that wide lane for MEO in the image I showed you? Very wide range, but not very practical for a prime location for satellites. There's no drag considered, but there's a thing called solar radiation pressure, which is a constant stream of particles emitted by the sun, also known as the solar wind. Popular assets we have in this region is the GPS. Yes. And interesting color for the their transmission information. But you also, this is the constellation of the GPS constellation here. But you also have other navigation satellite constellations in this region as well, such as GLONASS from Russia, Galileo for Europe, and Beidou for China. And they're all separated by at least 1,000 kilometers. So a very narrow area that they're using for MEO, navigation satellites. And finally, we have the geosynchronous region. That is any orbit that matches the Earth's rotational period, which is 23 hours, 56 minutes, and 4 seconds. The altitude is defined specifically at 35,786 kilometers and a few decimal points. And that region, or that altitude, is defined by the International Telecommunications Union, or ITU, which I'll talk to you about in more detail in a few minutes. But this is the most popular and contested orbit location. So much so that it has prompted international treaties and a regulatory agency. There's no atmospheric drag, but the area is dominated by solar radiation pressure and the gravitational pull of the Earth from the Earth, Sun, and the Moon. And a collision can happen in this area at approximately 3,000 meters per second. Popular assets that reside in this area include GOES, which is short for Geostationary Operational Environmental Satellite. And that is a series of 4 satellites that support weather forecasting, severe storm tracking, and meteorology research. And we can't forget our entertainment, our TV. We have DirecTV there. We can watch all of our favorite channels out from geosynchronous orbit. Okay, so with the amount of traffic and limited usable orbit lanes, you might imagine there are competing interests between different governments and corporations. And you'd be right. We have organizations that research, examine, and create laws and treaties regarding the use of space. First one being the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. They were established in 1959 by the UN General Assembly. They study legal problems arising from the exploration of space, and they were instrumental in the creation of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which was signed by 90 nations. And this stopped sovereign geo-claims by equatorial countries. It also established a foundation for an international system to manage the geo-belt. And that foundation was in the form of the International Telecommunications Union, which I mentioned earlier. They were established in 1865, originally as the International Telegraph Union. They were grafted into the UN in 1963 to manage the geo-belt for the purposes of preventing physical and electromagnetic interference. Its radio communications sector is responsible for the assignment of geoslots to nation states. Finally, we have the organization formed to do something about the present and foreboding space traffic problem. And this is called the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee. And this is a cooperative of 13 space agencies to exchange information on space debris research. The purpose is to identify debris mitigation options. To that end, they have made recommendations about how to dispose of satellites before reaching their end of life. Finally, what can you do to help with the space debris problem? Well, first, show the government and corporations that you care about the night sky by being a proponent of dark skies in your local government. Encourage your local government to install dark sky approved street lighting and to incentivize businesses to do the same. And personally, at home, you can install lighting that is motion activated with 3,000 lumens or less. And also make sure that the lights are directed downward to the ground and not to the sky. In closing, I think we can all agree that we live on one planet, one beautiful planet. Is it round or flat? Who knows? But as Carl Sagan would say, we have yet to find another one like it. And that makes us all connected. Just as it takes a village to raise a child, it takes us all to help sustain our planet. And that includes our backyard, the space around our planet. And besides, a ring of junk around Earth would not look as beautiful as savagery.
That's good.
Any questions? Couple of questions?
I would like to know if there's any.
Can you speak up, Heather, so we can hear your question?
Oh, okay. I would like to know if there's anything that we are putting into space as far as some sort of vehicle that helps attract and clean debris.
There have been a couple of.
Silly question.
No, there's not silly at all. There have been a couple of experimental missions to that purpose. But the problem is what I mentioned before, the laws and treaties revolving around, sovereignty for assets that belong to different countries, corporations. There's that possibility, and just the possibility of whether or not who's going to control that,
Right.
and is it a hostile action when it comes to interacting with another nation's satellite. But it's still in its infant stage. Hopefully we'll get to that point where we have a system such as what we have with the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space to manage that type of technology. I guess.
Do civilians have a say in like private companies similar to like Starlink versus like a military operation and what's being put into space?
Do civilians have a say
Like,
on
could
what?
we go to like our local government being able to have a say in what's being put in space for private companies?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I think when it comes to who can launch satellites, you have the Federal Communications Commission. They approve launches, but when it comes to, really, it's just a matter of how much money you have. You have colleges that launch microsatellites or CubeSats, and so when it comes to who has a say, it's just a matter of if a college or whoever or a corporation or government has the resources, you can launch anything up there. But there's no control over, no one from outside can come and say, oh, you can't launch that.
Why? Oh, wow.
Only that's what the FCC is more the regulatory agency.
I'm curious, how does all this space debris affect other launches of satellites and rockets and things like that?
It is, well, that's part of what I do. When there is a launch, the astrodynamics workstation that I work with, we have a system that can, when there's a new launch, we are part of the clearing of the trajectory once it reaches space. So we will let them know, as long as when they coordinate with my work center, if they are possibly going to collide with debris or another satellite before they launch.
I imagine it's getting a lot more complicated to avoid that, right? Or, you know, is there
Well-
more space out there that?
Well, let's put it like this, there are more threats of collisions out there, especially with the amount of Starlinks that are out there. Before Starlink, I did not see as many, but now when I look at the amount of threats or conjunction warnings, or collision warnings, most of them are Starlink involving some other object.
So what does Starlink do, and what is the relative height in terms of the troposphere and stratosphere? The greenhouse gases are in the troposphere. What, all these levels you talked about?
Well, they are well above the atmosphere. Even low Leo, that's the lower limit of low Leo. The upper limit of low Leo is 500 kilometers, and 160 kilometers, we would say, you're outside of the Earth's atmosphere. So anywhere between those regions. Yes, sir.
Can something be done about the excessive amount of Starlink satellites that are out there? How do you stop Elon Musk?
That is a good question. Advocate for the FCC not to approve the 30,000 that they are planning to launch, in addition to what they already have.
Yes, is there a mechanism by which a government, an agency, a volunteer group can monitor privately owned launches and make those companies responsible for retrieving their own space junk?
Okay, I missed the first part. You said, is there a way for
Is there a mechanism by which a group or an agency can be aware of all the privately sponsored launches and make those private companies responsible for retrieving their own space junk?
Oh, in space?
Yes.
There is not. There is not.
Too bad.
Yeah. Sorry. Okay, I think I've used up a lot of my time, so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.